All right, now let's continue with this checkbox we added in the last lecture. So this checkbox component in Angular Material implements a very similar API to the native checkbox we have in HTML5. For example, in HTML5, in order to add a checkbox, we need to use input with the type checkbox. Okay? Now here we have a bunch of attributes like checked. We can set it to checked. We have value. We have the change event and so on. So our custom checkbox in Angular Material also has these properties. So once again, if you go back to the documentation for this component, under the APIs tab, we can find all the properties implemented in this component. So here under directives, you can see the name of our component, that is MD checkbox. And below that, we have a table with a list of all the input and output properties. Now, there is not enough time to go through each of these properties, and it's really pointless. So I want to show you a few key properties that you're going to use in a lot of real-world applications. So back here, I'm going to delete this native HTML5 checkbox. Now, here's our MD checkbox. Here we can set the value exactly the same way of a native checkbox, or we can use property binding. We can bind this to a field or a property in our component. Similarly, we have the checked property. We can set this to checked. To check this by default, let's have a look back in the browser. So now our checkbox is checked by default. Or we can use property binding and bind this to a field or property in our component. So let's go to app.component. Here I'm going to define a field called isChecked and set it to true. Now back in the template, I can bind this checked property to isChecked. Save. Back in the browser. So we can see it's checked by default. We also have the change event that we can subscribe to. So let's bind this to onChange method in our component. And here we can pass the event object. Now let's go ahead and implement this method in our component. So back here, I'm going to add this onChange method. And for now, simply log something in the console. Back in the browser. So click this. Now look at the console. So this is our event object. It has two properties: source, which references our MD checkbox class, and checked. So here's our MD checkbox. You can see all these properties implemented in this component. Now let's say we have some content here. Let's say we have a div, and this checkbox acts as a toggle to show or hide that div. For example, we can change this label to show details. Here I'm going to add a div, and in this div we're going to have some details. Okay? Now when the checkbox is checked, this div should be visible. So here we can use ng if. Now here in this expression, we need to reference our checkbox. So we can simply give it a template variable. Let's call this show details. And here we can reference show details dot checked property. Okay, so back in the browser. Okay, you can see our details div is initially visible. If I uncheck this, it's gone. So this is how we work with Angular Material checkboxes.